The streets were quiet that evening. The sun had set, leaving behind a soft orange glow in the sky. In a small town where everyone knew each other, crime was rare. But tonight, something unexpected was about to happen. Frank Dawson, an 82-year-old war veteran, stepped out of the local grocery store. His steps were slow but steady. In one hand, he carried a small bag of groceries, and in the other, he gripped his old wooden cane. His silver hair and wrinkled face told the story of a man who had seen more than a lifetime's worth of battles. Just as he reached his old pickup truck, a police car pulled up beside him. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in his tired eyes. Frank frowned. It was unusual for the police to stop someone like this, especially an elderly man like him. Officer Bradley, a tall man with sharp features, stepped out of the car. Behind him, another officer followed. The people around the store noticed and began to whisper among themselves. "Frank Dawson?" Bradley asked, his voice firm. Frank adjusted his grip on his cane. "Yes, that's me. What's this about, son?" "You need to come with us," Bradley said. "You're under arrest." A heavy silence filled the air. The people outside the store gasped. A few even took out their phones to record what was happening. Frank's eyes narrowed. "Arrest? What for?" Bradley hesitated, then reached for his handcuffs. "We have orders. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Frank stood still. His mind raced. He had lived an honest life. He had served his country, fought in wars, and protected his people. What crime could he possibly have committed? "Son, I think you have the wrong man," Frank said calmly. "I'm sorry, sir," Bradley replied, "but we have to take you in." A crowd had gathered now. Murmurs of confusion spread among them. "He's a war hero," someone said. "This doesn't make sense," another whispered. "He's just an old man. What could he have done?" Frank sighed. There was no use arguing. His old bones were tired. If they wanted to take him, they would. Slowly, he turned around and placed his hands behind his back. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The sound was sharp, final. As they led him to the police car, Frank looked at the faces around him. Some were confused, some shocked, and some just curious. But none of them knew the truth. Just before he ducked into the back seat, he turned to Officer Bradley and said in a low voice, "You don't know what you've started." Bradley hesitated for just a second. There was something about Frank's voice that sent a shiver down his spine. But before he could respond, he closed the car door. The police car drove away, leaving behind a stunned crowd. Miles away, in the middle of the ocean, a satellite phone buzzed. A man in military gear picked it up. His face was covered in dirt, his muscles tense. As he listened to the message, his expression darkened. "They took Grandpa," the voice on the phone said. The man exhaled slowly. His blue eyes, sharp as a hawk's, burned with fury. His name was Jake Dawson, and he was coming home. Miles away from the small town, deep in the middle of the ocean, the waves crashed violently against the side of a military ship. Inside, Navy SEAL Jake Dawson sat on a metal crate, cleaning his rifle. His sharp blue eyes were focused, his face hardened from years of war. He had been on dangerous missions before, missions where one wrong move meant death. But nothing had ever prepared him for the message he was about to receive. The satellite phone beside him buzzed. He grabbed it, his instincts already telling him something was wrong. "They took Grandpa," the voice on the other end said. Jake froze. His grip tightened around the phone, his knuckles turning white. He hadn't spoken to his grandfather in weeks, but he knew one thing. Frank Dawson was no criminal. If someone had taken him, there was a reason, and Jake was going to find out what it was. His heart pounded as he stood up. Around him, his fellow SEALs were preparing for their next mission, but Jake's mind was no longer there. He had fought for his country, faced deadly enemies, and survived impossible situations, but this was different. This was personal. He walked straight to his commander's tent. The air inside was thick with tension as maps and battle plans covered the table. Commander Reese, a man with graying hair and tired eyes, looked up as Jake entered. "I need to leave," Jake said, his voice firm. Reese raised an eyebrow. "We deploy in 6 hours, Dawson. What's going on?" Jake clenched his jaw. "It's my grandfather. He's been arrested." Reese leaned back in his chair, studying Jake carefully. "Arrested? What for?" "I don't know, but I know this isn't normal," Jake replied. "I need to get back home." Reese sighed. "You walk away now. You might not come back. You know that, right?" Jake didn't hesitate. "Then so be it." There was a long silence. Finally, Reese nodded. "Get out of here. Go find out what's going on." Jake gave a quick nod of thanks, then turned and walked out. Within minutes, he was on a helicopter heading back to the mainland. His mind raced. If the police had arrested Frank, there had to be a reason. And if someone had set him up, they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. As the helicopter roared through the night sky, Jake stared at the horizon. He had spent years hunting enemies in the shadows, eliminating threats before they even saw him coming. Now he was bringing that same skill set home. Whoever had taken Frank was about to realize something terrifying. They had just made an enemy out of a Navy SEAL. Frank Dawson sat in a dimly lit jail cell, his hands resting on his knees. The cold metal of the handcuffs had left red marks on his wrists, but he didn't seem to notice. His mind was calm, his breathing steady. He had been in worse situations before, trapped behind enemy lines, outnumbered, wounded. But this was different. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was an old man in a small-town jail, accused of something he didn't even understand. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. A tall man in a dark suit stopped in front of his cell. Detective Harris. His sharp eyes studied Frank, filled with something between curiosity and suspicion. He didn't look like a small-town cop. He had the presence of someone who had seen things most men wouldn't understand. "You thought you could hide forever," Harris said, his voice low. Frank met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about." Harris smirked, then pulled a folded document from his coat. He took his time opening it, as if he wanted Frank to feel the weight of what was coming. Finally, he slid the paper through the bars. Frank took it, his hand steady despite his age. His eyes moved over the words, and for the first time since his arrest, his expression changed. A flicker of something deep in his gaze. Recognition, perhaps even regret. "That's impossible," he muttered. "Oh, it's very possible," Harris said. "You've been running from this for over 50 years. But it's finally caught up to you." Frank folded the paper slowly and placed it on the bench beside him. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Harris chuckled. "That's where you're wrong. I know exactly what I'm dealing with." He leaned closer, gripping the bars. "The question is, do you?" Frank sighed, leaning back against the wall. He had been prepared for many things in life, but he never thought his past would come back like this. Meanwhile, outside the station, a black SUV rolled to a stop across the street. The engine hummed quietly as the driver watched from the shadows. A man in a dark coat lifted a phone to his ear. "It's done," he said. "The old man is in custody." There was a pause, then a cold voice replied, "Good. Now, make sure he never talks." The call ended. The man in the SUV glanced toward the police station, his eyes filled with something deadly. Inside his cell, Frank closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He could feel it in his bones. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Jake Dawson stepped off the bus, his sharp eyes scanning the quiet streets of his grandfather's town. It had been years since he had last been here, but nothing had changed. The same small shops, the same old diner on the corner, the same slow-moving life. But something was different now. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the air. His fists clenched as he walked toward the police station. He had called ahead, demanding answers, but all they told him was that Frank was in custody and couldn't have visitors. That didn't sit right with him. An 82-year-old war hero locked up without explanation. It made no sense. And if there was one thing Jake had learned from years on the battlefield, it was that when things didn't make sense, there was always a bigger story hiding underneath. Pushing open the heavy station doors, he stepped inside. The front desk officer barely looked up before muttering, "We're not taking visitors." Jake pulled out his military ID and dropped it on the counter. "I'm not here for a visit. I'm here for answers." The officer hesitated, then sighed and picked up the phone. After a brief conversation, he hung up. "Detective Harris will see you." A few minutes later, a tall man in a dark suit walked in. The same sharp-eyed detective who had questioned Frank the night before. He studied Jake for a moment before offering a small smirk. "You must be the grandson." Jake's jaw tightened. "Where's Frank?" Harris folded his arms. "He's not allowed visitors at this time." Jake stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Then tell me why you arrested him." Harris's smirk didn't fade. Instead, he walked over to a filing cabinet, pulled out a thin folder, and dropped it onto the desk. "Your grandfather isn't just some old war veteran, is he?" Jake opened the folder, his eyes narrowing as he read. Old classified documents. Mentions of a top-secret mission from decades ago. Frank Dawson's name stamped on reports that had long been buried. "This is ridiculous," Jake muttered. "This was 50 years ago." Harris shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Some things never stay buried." Before Jake could press further, another officer entered, looking nervous. "Detective, there's someone here to see you." Harris frowned. "Who?" The officer swallowed. "Retired Colonel David Reese." Jake's head snapped up at the name. His old commander. What was Reese doing here? Harris's smirk finally faded. He gestured for Jake to stay put before walking toward the front. But Jake had no intention of staying put. He slipped out of the office and moved toward the side hallway, where holding cells were located. His heart pounded as he turned the corner, expecting to see his grandfather behind bars. But the cell was empty. Jake's stomach dropped. He grabbed the nearest officer by the arm. "Where is he?" The officer stammered. He was transferred." Jake's blood ran cold. "Transferred where?" The officer looked away. "I don't know." Jake released him, his mind racing. His grandfather had vanished from police custody. And that meant one thing. Someone else had taken him. This wasn't just an arrest. This was something bigger, something dangerous. And Jake was running out of time. The cold night air stung Jake's face as he stepped out of the police station. His heart pounded, his fists clenched. Frank was gone. The police had no answers, or maybe they did, and they weren't saying. Either way, Jake wasn't going to sit around and wait. He had spent years tracking enemies in the most dangerous places on Earth. If someone had taken his grandfather, they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a rough voice answered. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again, Dawson." "I need information," Jake said, walking quickly toward Frank's house. "Someone took my grandfather. They're covering it up." The man on the other end whistled. "If it's being covered up, you already know what that means." Jake did know. It meant this wasn't just some small-town police matter. Someone powerful was behind it. "Can you dig into old military records?" Frank Dawson. There was a mission he was part of, something big. It's connected to this. There was a pause. "I'll see what I can find. But be careful, man. If someone buried it this deep, they won't like you digging it up." Jake hung up and pushed open the door to Frank's house. The place was exactly as he remembered it. Small, neat, full of old photos and war medals. He walked to the living room, scanning the walls. His grandfather had always been a careful man. If he had seen this coming, he would have left a clue. Then he spotted it, an old wooden desk against the wall. Jake pulled open the drawers, flipping through papers and notebooks. Nothing unusual, But then he noticed something strange. A book on the shelf had been placed upside down. He grabbed it, and a small envelope fell to the floor. Jake picked it up and turned it over. His name was written on the front in Frank's careful handwriting. He tore it open and pulled out a single piece of paper. The message was short, but it made his stomach tighten. "If you're reading this, it's already begun." Jake exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the letter. Frank had known something was coming. He had tried to warn him. A noise outside made Jake freeze, the soft crunch of tires on gravel. He moved quickly, staying low, peeking through the window. 2 black SUVs had pulled up across the street. The doors opened, and several men in dark suits stepped out. They weren't cops. Jake's instincts kicked in. He had been hunted before. He knew what this was. They weren't here to talk. He slipped the letter into his pocket and moved fast, shutting off the lights. The men outside approached the house, their footsteps quiet but precise. These weren't amateurs. They were trained. Jake pressed himself against the wall as the front door handle turned. They were coming in, and he was ready. The front door creaked open, and the first man stepped inside, his movements slow and cautious. He held a silenced pistol in one hand, scanning the darkened room. Behind him, 2 more followed, their eyes sharp, their steps calculated. These men weren't ordinary thugs. They were professionals. Jake remained perfectly still, pressed against the wall just beyond their view. His heartbeat was steady. He had been in situations like this before. Enemy territory, outnumbered, outgunned. The trick was patience. The first mistake had to be theirs. One of the men whispered, "Check the back." Jake heard footsteps heading toward the kitchen. Another shadow moved toward the hallway, sweeping his gun across the room. Jake struck fast. Before the closest man could react, Jake grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply. The pistol dropped with a dull thud. In the same motion, Jake drove his elbow into the man's throat. A strangled gasp escaped him as he crumpled to the floor. The second man spun around, raising his gun, but Jake was faster. He grabbed a heavy lamp from the table and hurled it, shattering the bulb against the attacker's skull. The man stumbled back, dazed. The third man, the one in the kitchen, heard the commotion and rushed in. Jake saw the muzzle of the pistol rising and lunged. The shot went off, a silenced pop, barely missing him. Jake grabbed the man's arm, twisted it behind his back, and forced him down. With a swift motion, he slammed the attacker's head into the wooden floor. Silence filled the room. Jake exhaled slowly, checking the bodies. They were unconscious, but they'd wake up soon. He had no time to waste. He grabbed one of their phones, quickly scrolling through the messages. One text stood out. Target confirmed. Secure location until further orders. Jake's jaw clenched. They hadn't come to kill him. They had come to take him. Just like they had taken Frank. Sirens blared in the distance. Someone had heard the gunshot. Jake had no intention of explaining this to the local police. He grabbed his grandfather's letter and sprinted out the back door. As he disappeared into the night, only one thought burned in his mind. He wasn't running. He was hunting. Jake moved through the darkness like a ghost, his steps silent, his breath steady. He had escaped the house just in time. Minutes later, red and blue lights flashed against the night sky as police swarmed the scene. He watched from a distance, hidden in the trees. They would find the unconscious men inside, but those men wouldn't talk. Professionals like them followed orders, and Jake needed to find out who was giving them. He pulled out the stolen phone and checked the text again. Target confirmed. Secure location until further orders. There had to be more. He scrolled through past messages, searching for any clue. Then, he found it. A location pinned on a map, sent hours ago. It was just outside town. His mind raced. Was this where they had taken Frank? Jake didn't waste time. He jogged through the woods, avoiding the main roads. Within minutes, he reached the highway and hotwired an old pickup truck parked outside a gas station. He drove with precision, his sharp blue eyes fixed on the road ahead. If his grandfather was at that location, he wasn't going to wait for backup. He was the backup. The destination was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Jake parked a quarter-mile away and approached on foot. The building was old, rusted, with broken windows and faded paint. But inside, a few dim lights flickered. Someone was there. He crept closer, pressing his back against the wall. Through a small crack in the window, he saw two men in suits standing near a metal chair. And in that chair, bound and bruised, was Frank Dawson. Jake's blood ran hot. They had roughed up an 82-year-old war hero. Big mistake. Frank lifted his head slightly, his one eye swollen, but there was still defiance in his gaze. One of the men leaned in. "Just tell us where it is, old man. You don't have much time left." Frank chuckled, even through his pain. "Son, I've been through worse than this." Jake had heard enough. He scanned the area. Two men inside, but likely more guarding the outside. He had to move fast. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small pocket knife. It wasn't much, but it was all he needed. With controlled precision, he slipped around the side of the building. A guard stood near the entrance, smoking a cigarette. Jake moved like a shadow, wrapping his arm around the man's neck and putting him out in seconds. No noise, no struggle. He dragged the body into the darkness and took the guard's gun. Now he was armed. Inside, the two men were still questioning Frank. One of them sighed in frustration. "You're wasting our time." He pulled out a pistol and pressed it to Frank's head. Last chance. Jake stepped into the doorway, his stolen gun raised. His voice was calm, cold. "Put it down." The two men spun around, but they weren't fast enough. Jake fired twice. The first man dropped instantly. The second went for his gun, but Jake was already moving. A third shot sent him sprawling to the floor. Jake rushed to his grandfather's side, cutting the ropes. "Can you walk?" Frank grinned despite the pain. "I was just waiting for you to show up." Suddenly, a slow clap echoed through the warehouse. Jake spun around, gun raised. A tall figure stepped out from the shadows, dressed in a sleek black suit. His hair was silver, his face calm. "Well done, Jake," the man said. "I was hoping you'd come." Jake's grip tightened on the gun. "Who are you?" The man smirked. "Someone who knows the truth about your grandfather. And if you want to save him, you'll listen to what I have to say." Jake's eyes flicked to Frank. His grandfather, for the first time, looked worried. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just another enemy. He was the real threat.